Modern-day Egypt lives side by side with remnants from the times of the pharaohs. Giant statues, the pyramids that adorn the left bank of the Nile, where the sun sets, the magnificent temples such as those in Karnak and Luxor, built by the hard labor of hundreds of thousands of workers, still stand. But what is left is only a fraction of what the giant cities must have been. So why, in spite of the skill of these ancient builders, has so little of these ancient cities survived until today? The answer lies in the importance attributed to the buildings. While temples and pyramids were destined to withstand the onslaught of centuries, ordinary people under the pharaohs had to make do with crude mud bricks and straw dried in the sun, techniques that are still in use today. And yet, these were magnificent cities, such as Memphis, the pharaoh's first capital. We know about these cities because of the legacy of scribes, writers, at that time. This sculpture of a scribe from the Cairo Museum is an example of a man who could have lived his entire life in one of those crowded city streets at the time of the pharaohs. Scribes were highly respected figures in ancient Egypt. Years of study taught them to master the art of writing hieroglyphics, and they enjoyed privileges and honors reserved for upper classes. Writing was beyond the scope of the great majority of the population and was thus shrouded in mystery. Scribes made up a unique profession. Many of them earned their living by writing out and copying public and administrative documents. The Nile River was the lifeline of ancient Egypt and the home of most of the important cities. Memphis, just a few miles south of Cairo, was the first capital of the pharaohs. The road sign indicates the village of Mitrahina, announcing that we have arrived at the gates of the capital. It is difficult to imagine that such a desolate spot could have been the heart of one of the largest and richest cities in the ancient world. And yet, 4,000 years ago, there were majestic palaces and temples here, surrounded by an intricate maze of houses and streets. Memphis was home to some of the greatest minds of the era, brilliant scientists and refined sculptors, artists that created this alabaster sphinx, or this statue of Ramses II, one of the most impressive in all Egypt, buried under the sands for thousands of years. Nowadays, nothing remains of the ancient splendors of Memphis beyond this simple village, which is surrounded by the desert and a few date plantations. What became of this powerful metropolis, founded by King Menes in 3100 BC? This is what remains of the Temple of Ptah, thought to have been one of the largest in ancient Egypt. Much of it is still buried under the small hill where the village of Mitrahina lies today. The problem is, when Memphis went into decline, its monuments were dismantled and the stones were used as building material for new construction. In the distance, you can see one of the many temples that adorned Memphis in a later period. And this is how the capital itself might have looked if you attempted to cross the bustling streets of the city center over 4,000 years ago. As scribes have indicated, bakeries were an important part of life at that time. If you needed bread in the morning, you would have gone to a bakery like this one and bought a very special tasting bread. Bakers would remove the soft inside part of a loaf and sprinkle it with vinegar and water. Then the hollowed-out loaf would be stuffed with a mixture made of pepper, honey, mint, coriander, cheese, salt, and oil. The oven stood in the courtyard of the baker's workshop. Bartering was the sales method used, as money wasn't introduced until 500 BC, many years later. If you had to get some official papers signed, you would have to go to the residence of a high state official, who probably lived in a luxurious and prestigious house like this one. In the large dining room, he would probably have a display of exquisite vases, jars, and furniture, a mark of the taste and status of their owner. The higher social classes loved to surround themselves with exquisite objects and wore elegant clothing, complete with wigs and jewelry. Perfumes and cosmetics were also widely used by men. It was the custom to wear a cone of ointment on one's head, which melted in the heat of the day, saturating wigs and garments with perfume. In homes like this one, owners entertained their guests with sumptuous banquets. But what types of food and drink would be served at the table of a rich Egyptian? What was their diet? Since Egyptians aspired to reach the grand old age of 110, the recommended diet was varied and sensible. They ate 3 meals a day, a snack in the morning and another toward midday, and then the main meal, which corresponds to our dinner. There was no cutlery. Even the pharaoh and his family ate using their fingers, though it was considered good manners to use only the 3 fingers of the right hand. Then as now, bread was produced in a number of different varieties, and it was kneaded by using hands or even feet. Despite the attention paid to their diets, the ancient Egyptians were found to have bad teeth. Archaeological studies of numerous mummies have proved this. But how could they have good diets and bad teeth? The answer, surprisingly enough, was due to the bread. Since it was produced with stone-ground flour, it contained high quantities of sand, not something you want to crunch on. If you had problems with your teeth, you would have to go to a dentist, a profession that was in great demand at that time. The Egyptians loved their vegetables: garlic, onions, cucumbers, turnips, and lettuce. These were believed to make men amorous and women fertile. They also ate large amounts of seeds from chickpeas, broad beans, and lentils, which were exported all over the Mediterranean. Their favorite fruits were figs, pomegranates, and dates. Roast or grilled beef was considered a delicacy, though the preference was for birds such as geese, ducks, quail, pigeons, and even pelicans, which were also eaten by poorer people. On the other hand, it seems that chickens never appeared on the tables of the pharaohs and their subjects. Wine and strong beer were served at dinner. The wine was kept in sealed pitchers that had labels showing its name, origin, and vintage. These labels are some of the most curious written documents of the ancient world. The invention of writing took place around 3000 BC. As it spread, it allowed for organization of files and record-keeping within the country for the first time. Early writing was derived mainly from the observation of nature. Called hieroglyphics, it was a writing system that aimed to represent ideas by means of drawings. The word scribe, for example, was composed of the hieroglyphic zesh. It portrayed a scribe's work utensils: a palette with slots for red and black pigment, a jar or a water sack, a reed pen or a tool for smoothing papyrus, all tied up together. Thanks to this writing system and to the cursive version, hieratic script, we can understand the Egyptians' myths, fables, and scientific texts, along with their novels, travel journals, and adventure stories. The first adventure story in history is Egyptian, the story of Sinuhe, which was written more than 3,000 years ago. Egyptians had a strong sense of family, and women enjoyed a great deal of authority. The most common demonstration of affection was rubbing noses, while kissing was rare. Marriage was very important in ancient Egypt. The pharaoh could have more than one wife and, if he had the chance, lots of concubines. The man's goal was to give at least one child to each woman in his family. This is why Ramses II, one of the greatest Egyptian pharaohs, whose mummy is at the Cairo Museum, fathered more than 140 children. If you were looking for a lover and you couldn't find your way into their heart by regular means, you could resort to magic. Egyptians believed firmly in magic powers. There were magic cures for illnesses, formulas to ward off the evil eye, and love potions. Further down the Nile is Luxor, about 440 miles south of Cairo. Today it is a quiet place with boats skimming over the calm river waters and the narrow streets of the bazaar crossed by horse-drawn cabs popular with tourists. Luxor is the site of the ancient Egyptian city of Thebes, once the most powerful city in the world. Thebes was made capital instead of Memphis after its princes drove off the Hyksos people who had invaded Egypt around 1500 BC. Thebes, the city of 100 gates. A city where only the grains of desert sand exceeded the riches that its 500,000 inhabitants had accumulated. Unlike Memphis, Thebes has not disappeared completely. Amongst the modern buildings, you can still see temples, avenues of sphinxes, and other imposing structures of its magnificent past. The remains of the temple dedicated to the god Amun bear witness to this. They were restored by archaeological studies at the end of the 19th century, with the demolition of hundreds of houses that had been built over them. Some of the excavations are still going on. A 15th century mosque still occupies part of the first courtyard. The temple lies parallel to the Nile. Its dimensions are truly majestic, over 800 feet long and 200 feet wide. On this occasion, the statue of Amun left its more permanent residence in the Temple of Karnak and was moved on a sacred boat to visit this temple, its Ipet Reset, or Southern Harem. 2 obelisks stood at the entrance to the temple. Now only one remains, but it is truly grand, over 80 feet high and weighing more than 230 tons. What happened to the second obelisk? Watching over the entrance are colossal statues of Ramses II, the pharaoh who was a fearless warrior. In the northwest corner of the temple's first courtyard is the Mosque of Abu el-Hagag, held in great esteem by Muslims. Among the columns here are statues of the pharaohs Amenhotep III and Ramses II. Here's what the entrance to the Temple of Amun would have looked like in ancient times. The facade was richly decorated with scenes from the epic battle fought by Ramses II against the Hittites in 1285 BC in Kadesh, in modern-day Syria. We can see now how the 2 massive obelisks would have dominated the entrance. The mystery of what had happened to the second obelisk was solved in 1835, when King Mehmet Ali presented it to King Louis Philippe of France. Less than 2 miles separate Luxor from Karnak, the site of the enormous complex dedicated to a trinity of gods, Amun, Montu, and Mut. Ten pylons, enormous surrounding walls, and hundreds of columns, are laid out over a surface area that is more than 4,000 feet long and almost 2,000 feet wide, making this the largest temple ever built anywhere in the world. It took 2,000 years to build, and all of the pharaohs contributed something to the final layout. Once you enter the temple, you come to the biggest courtyard of all Egyptian temples, over 300 feet wide and 260 feet long. In the center of the courtyard, only one tall column survives of the 10 that made up the cloister. These were built by Pharaoh Taharka around 670 BC. This is where the sun boat was kept, which was used for the solemn processions from Karnak to Luxor. Let's see how the site would have looked in all its majesty. The cloister was composed of 10 columns that were each over 60 feet high. Behind the columns, you can see the decorations of the second pylon, which was erected by Ramses II. In the center was a pedestal on which the sacred boat containing the statue of the god Amun was placed. The dimensions of this area are simply colossal. Beyond the second pylon, you enter one of the most imposing monuments we have inherited from Egyptian art. The huge hypostyle, which was 330 feet wide and 174 feet deep, with 134 columns. Enormous architraves raised the height of the ceiling to 75 feet. The 122 lateral columns, with papyrus-shaped capitals, are lower. This made it possible to put in windows that create amazing effects of light and shadow. The decorative scenes on the inside walls of the atrium, carved over 3,000 years ago, depict processions and coronation ceremonies. Here we can see Ramses II paying homage to the Theban divinities. The boat is taken in a procession by the priests of Amun, dressed up as mythological beings. The central axis of the temple leads to the most sacred part of the whole complex, the granite room that held the sacred boat. This is one of the 2 obelisks erected by Queen Hatshepsut. Almost 100 feet high, it is one of the tallest in all of ancient Egypt. Upon her death, her stepson, Pharaoh Thutmose III, who apparently detested her, had a wall built around the obelisk to obliterate the memory of the dead queen. The festival hall built for Thutmose III was later turned into a Christian church, as is seen from the faces of the saints that can still be distinguished on the columns. Of the many rooms in the temple, one of the most interesting is known as the Botanical Garden, because it is decorated with exotic plants and animals, in testimony to the devotion displayed by pharaohs to their gardens and agriculture. And this is the great sacred lake, where the priests of Amun-Ra used to purify themselves in the holy water that was channeled here from the Nile. This gigantic granite scarab, or beetle, was considered sacred by the Egyptians. It is said to be of good fortune if you walk around it. Going back north now on the Nile, we come to Cairo, capital of modern Egypt and a metropolis of almost 16 million inhabitants. Cairo was never a capital under the pharaohs. During their reign, there was only a small settlement here called Keriaha, which means place of battle, a name it earned because, according to legend, it was where the gods Horus and Seth fought. The only thing we know about the city's past is that around 500 BC it was called Babylonia and was an important commercial center. If you visit the Copt quarter, one of the most ancient and picturesque parts of Cairo, you'll see that it is inhabited today by Orthodox Christians. It contains one of the most important temples in Christianity, the church that played host to the Holy Family and Jesus during their time in Egypt. During the Roman domination, Emperor Trajan had a fortress built here that was flanked by two huge round towers. The remains of the South Tower have been partially restored, while the North Tower was incorporated into the Church of St. George. Further up the Nile, where the river hits the sea, is Alexandria, the city founded by Alexander the Great in 332 BC. It is the last capital of ancient Egypt, and where Cleopatra, the last direct descendant of the pharaohs, lived and died. Today, with 6 million people, Alexandria is the second largest city in Egypt. Though it is an enchanting spot, like most modern cities, the chaotic traffic detracts somewhat from its appeal. In ancient times, it was the site of a great library, where thousands of scribes worked, documenting the ancient Egyptian lifestyle for posterity. By and large, however, the splendor of the ancient city has been completely buried under the modern neighborhoods. There was a famous lighthouse, the Pharos at Alexandria, built here in 279 BC, that was subsequently damaged by earthquakes. In 1480, Sultan Qaitbay used most of its remains to construct this fortress, a masterpiece of military architecture. Some of the lighthouse's granite columns can still be seen in the gate of the main tower, and in the surrounding walls that plunge into the sea. Today, it is difficult to imagine the lighthouse in all of its ancient splendor. But when it was built, it was almost 400 feet high and became one of the 7 wonders of the world. The lighthouse was one of Cleopatra's favorites. This was her city, a city she loved more than the Roman generals she courted. With her suicide in 30 BC came the end of 3,000 years of rule by the pharaohs. Egypt lost her independence and became a province of the Roman Empire. As time went by, many of the cities of the pharaohs were abandoned and slowly fell into ruin. The simple houses built with mud bricks disappeared, and many of the monuments became open-air quarries, their stones used to make other buildings. Stones were even removed from the magnificent pyramids. The madrasa of Sultan Hassan in the city of Cairo was built with stones from the pyramids in 1362. It was a sort of university college, and its design is considered a masterpiece of Islamic architecture. The palace is perfectly proportioned, and its beauty owes a lot to the stones removed from the pyramids and used in its construction. This was a destiny that befell other monuments in the capital over the course of centuries, as magnificent works created by the pharaohs were dismantled. But still today in Egypt, the past and present come together as in no other country in the world. The writers or scribes from that time have left us with a treasure trove of literature that documents the amazing episodic adventures of pharaohs and queens, of great loves and tragic battles, and gods for every purpose. Their writings challenge the passing of the centuries, and in a way, proclaim the immortality that was sought by the pharaohs. The discovery of the Bonampak frescoes unraveled mysteries on the customs and traditions of a civilization that had developed over a period of nearly 3,000 years, a civilization that reached its height between 200 and 900 AD, and then experienced a relentless decline until it almost completely disappeared around 1500, a little before the Spanish conquistadors arrived. The cities were abandoned and slowly swallowed up by the jungle. Yet the people who once lived in them had not disappeared. They merely scattered throughout the region now known as the Yucatan Peninsula in present-day Mexico, where the ancient traditions of the Maya are still present. Archaeologist John Lloyd Stephens wrote these words in his diary on May 11, 1840, about his expedition to Mexico. "In the history of the world, nothing impressed me more than the sight of this big and attractive city, now barren and lost." Stephens had set off many months earlier on the tracks of stories about cities hidden in the wild tropical jungle and a people who had mysteriously disappeared. His journey through uncharted terrain must have been difficult, with scorching temperatures and thick vegetation. And though on previous trips he had examined Egyptian pyramids, ancient monuments in Italy, and Greek temples in Athens, it was here in the jungles of Central America that he was overwhelmed by an intense feeling of astonishment. He walked out of the forest and suddenly realized that he had reached the ruins of an ancient Maya city, Palenque. Stephens and an architect, Frederick Catherwood, who painted watercolors of the area, were breathless when they saw the city's sacred grounds. It was clear that only men with ingenious minds could have planned this city, and that expert hands had built it. It was also clear that a whole new era of scholarship on an unexplored civilization would now present itself. Gods and goddesses, rulers and heroes, an entire account of hidden Maya culture and mythic history. At the time of its splendor, Palenque covered an area of over 6 square miles with a population of tens of thousands. The most important structures date from the period between 630 and 700 AD, when Kin Pakal and his son Chan Balum ruled the kingdom. The palace, the home of the royal family, was erected in the city center on a 33-foot-high platform. The palace in reality was just a group of various buildings built one against the other, but in its own way, it was an architectural masterpiece, with cellars, chambers, and rooms with rather low ceilings arranged around a courtyard. The bas-reliefs that decorate the walls are still striking today, even though many of the colors, which Stephens and Catherwood marveled about, have almost completely faded. Some glyphs, the round-figured ideograms which Maya writing is composed of, were carved into the steps of the middle court, while along the walls, stone plates were decorated with images of prisoners who must have been high-ranking officials judging from their rich garments. From the western side of the palace is a full view of the majestic Temple of the Inscriptions. In 1952, archaeologist Alberto Ruiz made an incredible discovery inside this pyramid-like structure. On the upper platform, he discovered a deep passage, a kind of tunnel that penetrated into the pyramid. The tunnel had been blocked for centuries by tons of earth and stones, so the descent into the depths of the structure was difficult and dangerous. After months of digging, Alberto Ruiz descended the entire length of the tunnel. He reached an underground room where he discovered a great sarcophagus containing the tomb of King Kin Pakal, who lived at Palenque in 700 AD. It was one of the most important. For the inhabitants of Palenque, the most important buildings in the city were those making up a group now called the Cross Group. It is composed of 3 rectangular buildings surmounted by a crest-like structure. They are temples dedicated to Maya divinities and owe their name to a mistake made by the first discoverers who mistook the symbol of the ceiba, the cosmic tree of the Maya, for the Christian cross. At the height of its splendor, this grand architecture in the middle of a dense jungle must have been a truly impressive sight. All the buildings were painted red, to the Maya, the color of life. The main temple was decorated with stuccos portraying King Pakal together with the god Kappa, protector of the ruling class. All the bas-reliefs of the buildings at Palenque prove that the cult of the gods was tied to the social class that worshippers belonged to. The god Ekchua, for instance, was the guardian of merchants. Even the colors used in pictures had to conform to precise rules. People's skin was colored red. Gods were painted in blue, the color of the sky, and animals and plants were painted yellow. Maya society was structured like a pyramid, headed by a king who had divine powers similar to the powers of ancient Egyptian pharaohs. Below the king were the priests, nobility, and warriors. At the bottom of the pyramid was the rest of the population, mostly peasants and craftsmen. The peasants led a relatively quiet life. There were no carts on the streets, since the Maya did not know the wheel. Their city markets were small and drew only a few people. You might hear the call of turkeys and see a few buyers and sellers bargaining over various goods, but most of the inhabitants had their own fruit orchards and vegetable gardens. There were craftsmen, however, who made special objects not sold in the markets. Objects made of jade. This hard, durable, beautiful mineral was so precious that only members of the nobility were able to afford it and hire the skilled craftsmen necessary to work with it. Jade objects would have been traded in one of the richest cities of the Yucatan, Chichen Itza. Chichen Itza was founded at the end of the 8th century AD and represented the consolidation of a powerful Maya state sustained by trade, tribute, and war. In the middle of town there was a great pyramid known as El Castillo, the castle, which apparently was dedicated to the worship of Kukulkan, the Maya name of the Aztec god Quetzalcoatl. The 365 steps of the Castillo suggest that the building functioned as a giant chronographic marker, and on the days of the equinox, the sun casts a shadow that illuminates a serpent on the north staircase. Not surprisingly, Kukulkan's symbol was a feathered serpent. At the top, the Maya had erected a vaulted temple decorated with bas-reliefs depicting warriors. Only priests were entitled to officiate at ceremonies and appear in front of the population from the height where the temples were erected. The Temple of the Warriors served a different role, however, for it was here that the Maya engaged in sacrificial rites. In the early years of the first millennium, the Maya were thought of as peaceful timekeepers and skywatchers. But around 1000 AD, they encountered another people, the Toltecs, who imposed their culture and ruling lifestyle upon the Maya. Their influence is seen in the similarities between the buildings and sculptures at Chichen Itza and those at Tula, the Toltec capital, hundreds of miles away. One of the best examples is El Caracol, an imaginative building in the shape of a spiral whirl of a conch, an attribute of Kukulkan, whom the structure embodies. Kukulkan was identified with the planet Venus, and from tiny upper-story windows in this structure, one could observe this mythical planet. The Maya were familiar with the positions of the stars and studied their movements. In keeping track of the solar and lunar years and the cycles of visible planets, they developed a highly sophisticated long-count calendar that dated back to August 13th, 3114 BC. The influence of the Toltecs is also seen in the comparison of stone sculptures from Tula called Chacmul with the one at the Temple of the Warriors at Chichen Itza. Under the influence of the Toltecs, the old system of government was eradicated. Warrior kings replaced more benign monarchs and priests. And the practice of human sacrifice was introduced. An example of this is seen in the Chacmul at the top of the stairway of the Temple of the Warriors. A reclining statue is faced toward El Castillo, holding a bowl in his hand. It is here where they put the hearts torn out of the chests of sacrificial victims. Sports and ball playing were part of daily life at Chichen Itza, except there was a lot more riding on the outcomes than prizes or trophies. They played a game called pelota, and the ball court at Chichen Itza was the largest in Central America, 560 feet long and 165 feet wide. The object of the game, which was more a religious rite than recreational, was to throw a rubber ball into a stone hoop. What made the task hard was the fact that players couldn't use their hands or feet. They had to use their hips or elbows to move the ball. A bas-relief shows two teams competing against each other, but this bas-relief shows the bloody outcome. A player who was defeated is being decapitated, the fate of players from the losing side. A long platform bears depictions of skulls, presumably the skulls of the losers. But according to some scholars, winners as well might have been beheaded. It was considered an honor, having won, to go to a heaven of warriors. The practice of human sacrifice was described by Bishop Diego de Landa, a Spaniard who lived in the 16th century. He himself was guilty of committing a number of crimes while attempting to convert the inhabitants to Christianity. Among these, the so-called auto da fe, or public burning of Mani, in which all written documents from this classical period of the Maya were destroyed by fire. The Maya were the first people of the New World to keep historical records, with a written history that begins in 50 BC. But today, only 4 of thousands of books written in hieroglyphs still exist, one of which is the so-called Dresden Codex. Maya books were made of fig tree bark folded like an accordion. Although everyone could learn how to write, only priests were allowed to compile books and read sacred scriptures. The greatest difficulty in deciphering Maya writing lies in interpreting the glyphs, since they are based on a system that combines ideograph and phonetic elements. It's a complicated system that was finally unraveled by Russian epigraphist Yuri Norosev, who wrote the first Mayan grammar that was published in 1950. The territory inhabited by the Maya was vast, and since horses and donkeys had become extinct on the continent tens of thousands of years earlier, to make foot travel easier, the Maya built roads. Actually, an entire road system that linked key cities to places of pilgrimage. Uxmal was one of the most important places of worship of Maya civilization, and reached its peak between the 8th and 11th centuries AD. Uxmal was the administrative and religious capital of the Maya, who lived in the hilly zone of Puuc, a name also used for the region's peculiar architectural style. The finest example of Puuc style is the governor's palace, nearly 330 feet long, probably the seat of the authorities. The building has a cornice decorated with masks portraying the god Chak. It was originally entirely colored like all Maya buildings, and the elaborate renderings of gods and symbols attest to the wide range of Maya interests. However, the most majestic monument at Uxmal was the Pyramid, or Temple of the Magician. It was erected primarily to worship the gods of heaven, but it too served as an observatory to study the movements of celestial bodies. Like the governor's palace, the pyramid was decorated with representations of the mask of the god Chak. This sculpture, portraying the tattooed face of a priest coming out of a serpent's mouth, was discovered inside the pyramid. The buildings at Uxmal exhibit the high level of perfection reached by Maya stone carvers. Not all Maya settlements were situated in the middle of the jungle. Fortified cities were also erected by the sea to make the coast safer. One of these places, built by the Caribbean Sea, was Tulum. This was the site of the first meeting in 1518 of the Maya and the Spanish who arrived by sea. The conquistadors had to be amazed to see such a formidable city in this beautiful natural setting. In the Temple of the Frescoes are some of the most awe-inspiring Maya paintings that have stood the test of time. There are illustrations of the gods of the Maya pantheon that dominated the universe of the living as well as of the dead. The drawings evidence a culture that was sensitive to the importance of color. When Captain Juan de Grijalva landed for the first time on the shore of Tulum, he thought it looked as big as Seville in his native Spain. He would have seen buildings painted in vermilion red, light blue, white, and bright green. Unfortunately, only a few traces of these colors remain today. The castle, or El Castillo of Tulum, is certainly the most important monument of this city. It was partly destroyed in the early 20th century and was restored based upon the illustration Catherwood made of it when he arrived in Tulum. No one was sure of the function of El Castillo until Michael Kramer, an archaeologist of the National Geographic Society, reached the conclusion that it was a lighthouse used for navigation. In fact, not very far from Tulum is the island of Cozumel, which in Mayan language means place of the swallows. In ancient times, there were many vessels that sailed back and forth between the island and the mainland. The sailors of these boats probably relied on the help of lighthouses like the one at Tulum to get their bearings. The Maya enjoyed a civilization and a culture that is a study in contrasts. They had respect for nature and considered animals sacred, and yet the animal called human was expendable in sacrifice. Blood was the mortar of Maya life. They were great historians and builders, and yet it never came to them that the wheel could be used as a means of transport. They were superstitious and feared thunder and lightning, but studied and predicted astral phenomena with modern precision. The contradictions of the Maya represent their greatest mystery. What we do know is that they spent their time in unison with the forces of the universe. Poet Miguel Ángel Asturias wrote, "The Maya were a people who counted their days like diamonds. They had faith in their gods, in their smoke rites, in dreams, and in the wisdom of words, things that 5 centuries of devastation, exploitation, and oblivion could not destroy. The Maya live on, thanks to what they have left for our civilization to discover."